Welcome to all of you, and particularly warm welcome to Angela Roothaan. Thank you for accepting the invitation to speak to us today in the SIP lecture series organized by the Society for Intercultural Philosophy. I've had the chance to listen to Angela just a couple of weeks ago, presenting part of her research on Bantu philosophy. And I thought this so interesting that we should get the chance and have her speaking in this lecture series. And so thank you, you accepted doing this. Let me briefly say a few words. Angela is associate professor at the Vrije University in Amsterdam. She has a background in continental philosophy and then turned to African philosophy and intercultural philosophy. In 2019, she initiated the Dutch Research Network on African intercultural philosophy and the Bantu Philosophy Project. That functions as an international scholarly network for exchange of research findings and sources regarding the work by Placide Tempel's Bantu philosophy, which dates back to 45, 46. We'll learn more about this during the lecture. Yes, thank you for being with us, and I'm very much looking forward to learn more about this, about Placide Tempel's work and the also the publication history as you're researching on this. The floor is yours, Angela, please.
Yes, thank you, Niels, for the nice introduction. And indeed, I will spend a bit more words on the publication and translation history of the work than I did in the first version of this lecture, which I gave in Tübingen. So the title is The Dynamic Web We Live In, and that's actually taken from or related to a quote from Placide Tempels in his book Bantu Philosophy, in which he compares the relation between all living being as a spider web, as being connected all around to everything there is. And so I want to my lecture will have mainly 3 parts, but before I come to these 3 parts, I'll give an introduction to why I talk about Bantu philosophy and what is his relation to what we call eco-phenomenology, and also go a bit more into the specific relation he had to scholastic terminology in philosophy. So we start with the question, why Bantu philosophy? So I've been working in this what I call the Bantu philosophy project for about around 6 or 7 years, and the cause of my my prolonged interest in Bantu philosophy has been that I found, as soon as I started to read the reception history, so the criticisms and also the applause for Bantu philosophy among African philosophers, I found something sometimes a bit off. I often had the reaction, did they read the same book as I did? And in the end, after so many years of research and going to the archives in Belgium, where they keep all the different prints and all the letters that Tempels wrote to his intellectual friends, I found that indeed they read a different book than I did, because being native Dutch speaker, I started reading, of course, the Dutch version. And Tempels was a Flemish Dutch Belgian missionary going to the Congo and living there among several peoples who were all speaking different Bantu languages. And so he tried to understand their way of life, to actually, the first idea was to become a better missionary, so to transfer the Christian message better to them. But this attempt to understand their worldview, their ontology, their understanding of reality, took on a whole life of its own, because he then published the book Bantu Philosophy, which intervened in many different disciplines. Actually, it intervened in theology, it intervened in ethnology, it intervened in mainly also in philosophy. Now I'll come to that, but I found that they really read a different book because of the translation history. So I found that the French and the English versions of the book, that are mostly read, of course, around the world, are really mutilated versions of the Dutch. And I will come back to that. But also, I found that Bantu philosophy, to my the way I interpreted it, attempted to do something that has been up till now not very well understood. It attempted to be a cross-cultural philosophy, so to read through European philosophy into an African philosophy, and it also attempted to understand ontology from a pluralistic concept, which was, I think, in that time, at least in the existential phenomenology world in which the Catholic philosophers in Belgium and the Netherlands lived, was not very common, and in philosophy, European philosophy, as such, it wasn't. The only kind of serious work into what we would call pluralistic ontology had been done in that time by William James around 1900, the American pragmatist philosopher. So Tempels himself already had directly a translation problem, because his original language was Dutch, of course, as a Belgian person, which Belgium is a bilingual country, or actually trilingual. It has a little German part, but mainly French and Dutch. So he also understood the French well, of course, but he first had to try to understand the languages of the Congolese with which he lived, which were mainly the languages Kiluba and Kibemba, so the Bemba and the Luba peoples. And he had to translate it into his European framework, and which is mostly a Latin collection of Latin and Greek concepts, thinking in Dutch, etc. So it was already quite complex. And this has played out in the history of the work. And to illustrate this, and I'm still in my introduction, I want to read an important quote that I found in one of the letters he wrote to his most important intellectual correspondent, Émile Pousseau, also Belgian, but mainly French-speaking. And he wrote to him, and I translate in English, who tries to understand this terminology, of course meant the Bantu terminology, in a Western philosophical sense, is in deep trouble. And for the few people maybe here who understand Dutch, it is even quite funny and characteristic of his style. He wrote in Flemish Dutch, wie dit probeert te begrijpen van de westerse filosofische begrippenkader, zit diep in de patatten. And we all know that the Flemish are very famous worldwide for their French fries, and patatten are French fries. So we are deep into them if you deep in trouble if you try to understand it from a European perspective. Now, this was a very brief into why I read this work and why I'm so interested in it. And this interest also has something to do with the bigger events happening in philosophy in that time, especially also in Europe. I already said the Catholic philosophers, mainly in Belgium and the Netherlands, the south of the Netherlands, were reading existential phenomenology. And so this phenomenological sphere has also an influence on his work. Now, what is in the most general sense, the aim of phenomenology? I would say it is the attempt to describe reality as it appears to us. But that doesn't mean that we prioritize the phenomenal over the real. It rather wants to overcome this distinction between the phenomenal and the real, what appears and what is actually there. This is a distinction made by Immanuel Kant famously, and Kant also made distinctions in the 18th century between the noumenal and the empirical, so the intelligible and the what is to be perceived, between freedom and determinism, between the ethical and social, and between the rational and the natural. And I understand phenomenology as wanting to overcome all these dualisms and to describe how reality appears to us. So it is already about the real. And Temples does this while he's placing himself in the life and the thought of the Bantu peoples with whom he lived. And he finds then that the real appears as active being and not as being that is able to act. So this was his main discovery, and onto this many commentaries to Bantu philosophy have been directed, mostly related to the term vital force. I will get back to that as well. So he said that in the European conception and philosophy, we distinguish being and action in the sense that being is the primary thing and action is secondary thing. So action can be explained from static being concept. And he said the Bantu conception of the world is just the other way around. Everything is action, everything is energy, is movement, and this energy can explain being. So that is the other way around. So now, how did Temples try to explain this? He struggled mainly with scholastic philosophy and its terminology. So that typical version of Catholic existential philosophy was not discussing so much Cartesian or Kantian doubt and divisiveness, but it was at the same time focused or rooted deeply in scholastic philosophy. And so Thomas Aquinas and other medieval philosophers, and Thomas Aquinas mainly going back to Aristotle, were really central in this thought. And he focuses then a lot on the concepts of essence and being, and it is also very central in Aristotle. And the main thing is in his work that he understood Spence' essence in a very specific way to give life to this idea that everything is energy in the African conception. So he understands essence not as general, like we often do it, like the essence of all the different dogs is the general idea of a dog, you know, that's the Platonic Aristotelian idea of essence. but he understands, and so essence he doesn't understand it as general and fixed, but as individual and active. So every being has its own individual essence, and that is its life energy. Now, one of the main experts, I think, worldwide on Bantu philosophy is Mutumba Nkulu Senga. He has written that one cannot understand Bantu philosophy well and interpret it well without reading some of his unpublished works, and also by studying the extensive archive letters, which I already referred to. Now, this is not so easy, and of course, more so for many African philosophers, because these archives are not all digitalized. Most of them are not. And so one has to go there physically. And then again, one has to bridge the language divide. So Temple's own work and many of the reactions to that work are in French, in German, in Dutch, sorry, in French, in Dutch, but also in Swahili. So he knew all these languages himself, and others who reacted on his work in his time reacted in one of those languages. So this is mainly the introduction to my talk, and now I will present three main points. And I can only pick a few things that I found in my studies in the archive, which is in Belgium, where they keep archives of many missionary orders, and it has changed my view on this work really deeply. So first, I will go into in depth into one letter he wrote to his friend Pousseau, and the letters between Tempels and Pousseau are really several several folders. It's really a lot, and this one he wrote in 1946, so shortly after the publication of the book. The second part of the rest of my lecture will go into problems with the English translation of 1959, the King translation, translated by the minister Colin King. And the third part will go into a recent paper on Bantu philosophy by someone who also knows Bantu languages, that is Patrick Munga Kasimba, and he wrote into a collection that appeared 2 years ago in the Congo in French, La philosophie Bantu du Père Placide Tempels. So it collects the French language articles mainly by Congolese authors. And this specific paper by Munga Kasimba, I think, solves some of the interpretation issues that I found in Bantu philosophy. Now let me start with the first, with this letter, which I showed to you briefly. It is, can you see it? Yes, it is typed. So they type their letters often. Sometimes they're also in handwritten. And to say something more about this letter, I also have to go into this translation issues, but I will focus more on this English translation, the second part. But let me start with briefly outlining the factual history of the publication. So Tempels was struggling with how to missionize the Bantu peoples he lived with. At a certain point, he got ill and went to the hospital in Elizabethville, that is the colonial name of the capital there. And in that hospital, he met Emile Pousseau. And Emile Pousseau was a magistrate, a colonial magistrate, so he studied law. And he was also well connected to the initiator of the Catholic Action Movement, Cardijn. And this movement was mainly focused on democratizing Catholicism and de-hierarchizing. So taking ordinary people seriously, taking the working class seriously, etc. And Pousseau was very passionate in this, sometimes quite radical position in a colonial situation. And he pushed Temples actually to write this book because he said, you cannot elaborate your missionary project if you don't understand their ontology well. So you really have to write a book on their philosophy. And that's what Temples did. And over the years, he kept corresponding with Pousseau about what happened to the book. Now, it was first published in several chapters in two colonial magazines that appeared in the Congo. Equatoria and Band are the names of those. So these are kind of primary versions of the book. Then interest was raised and people said you have to publish the book in French. And Pousseau had already started to translate these chapters in French. But Pousseau being considered too radical by many people, and also they thought his translation was a bit too literal and not too easy to read. So when Lovania, there was a publishing house there from the, actually driven by the Leuven University in Belgium, they wanted to publish it. They asked Temples to find another translator. The other translator was Rubens, also a friend of his. And Rubens started the first problem, so to speak, because his translation that was published in 1945 already mistranslated a lot in the book. And as different authors have said, the mistranslations in the French and the English version never go well for the Bantu. So the book gets a more colonial and more racist tone. Temples was not quite happy with the translation. And Pousseau then said to him, get rid of that frustration. Now you publish the work in Dutch in Belgium. Then you have a good version. So Temples did that. So he made a final version in Dutch from the different chapters, and he subtitled it with original text. Now, when Présence Africaine, the famous African publishing house founded by Senghor and Diop, wanted to publish the book again in 1949, they had to rely on the Rubens translation. Now, Temples wanted to restore some of the original terms and wanted to change the work a bit back to his intentions. And we have found in the archive that not all of these corrections of Temples have been taken over in the publication of 1949. So the 1949 publication is often seen as authorized by Temples, but he was not happy with that as well. So many of the problems of 1945 remain in 1949. Then in 1959, Présence Africaine published an English translation, and the English minister, Colin King, was asked to do that. And King took so many liberties that it became really problematic. So I will get back to these later again. But Temples felt all over this publication and translation period that took many years. He was quite frustrated that his description of Bantu ontology was not well understood. And in a letter that I just showed to you from 1946, so recently after the publication of the French and Dutch version, he complains to Pousseau about this. And he discusses there the scholastic terminology. because many of the first readers of Bantu philosophy were priests and missionaries like Temples himself. So they were mostly focused on these scholastic concepts of essence and being, and some of them denied specific ontology to Bantu thought. As they said, the Bantu didn't understand essence really, only a kind of dynamism. When everything is action, you don't understand being really as essential being. That was the main critique of Bantu philosophy by the Catholic theological reader, so to speak. And Temples then refers to Aristotle, and Aristotle defines essence as that which is, and energy as the natural force, the principle of agency that is in and by itself and not, essence is in and by itself and not accidental. So Temples then tries to explain it, and now I quote him. He says, where we, he means the Europeans, where we seek the essence in being and order everything according to genus and species, aesthetic view, the Bantu only see the natural force in being. They see the essence as a principle of agency, a dynamical view, and they order all being according to that principle. So the ordering of being is not static, as in categories, as if you can put everything in boxes in a drawer cabinet, but it is already dynamical. So this order of all being is alive, so to speak, and changing. So the concept of force or energy is the essence of beings for him, beings, so plural. I already said in the beginning, he takes essence not as a general concept, but as an individual concept. So every individual being has its own essence. So that is his reaction to these criticisms by the theologians that the Bantu didn't have their own ontology. So further on in the same letter, he summarizes once again, I quote, all is comprehended in this that we say, or at least many scholastic philosophers in our Western world do, the essence is the static element that is the supporting base of accidental qualities, among which is force. Whereas the Africans say, well, that static element of yours, we understand dynamically. We think it is in its nature to be force. We don't take or understand that to be static. Quote ended. So the essence is the energy. When we relate this now back to the developments in phenomenology of the first part of the 20th century, we may be reminded of the pragmatism of William James, whom I already mentioned as having a pluralistic ontology. For James also, reality is what is at work, and it's not some fixed, static, essential being. So I must explain to those who are really into the Husserlian school of phenomenology that I take American pragmatism, especially that of William James, also as an important version of phenomenology, the American version, so to speak. So that was the first part of my lecture in which I tried to say something about this reaction to the first criticisms and the struggle of Temples with these scholastic concepts. Now, I will go further into the translation issues, and especially then now into the King translation of 1959. And I already said in the Robbins translation in French already we see many issues, not only the normal translation issues you always have to make something readable in another language, but really changing certain concepts and making the text more racist. So in the King translation, you see that one is especially problematic. mostly where it obscures the nuance in Dutch between zijn and wezen, being and essence. He translates both by being. So it's always being, so it becomes a bit flat, so to speak. The philosophical problematic that Temples discusses, which I have just explained, this understanding of essence as individual essence, etc., that really disappears in the English translation. And also that essence is not to be taken as a static category, not as a general category, but as a driving natural force. That is also less well understood in the English translation, because it is being for King, the translator. Now, a further problem in King is when I found when I was working on my own translation of the Dutch version, because this wasn't mentioned in the introduction, but it said so in the announcement of the lecture, I think, that last year I published a new Dutch version in the Netherlands, where I freshened up the a bit old Dutch from 1945. This may be a bit weird for English or French speakers, but the Dutch language is a language which changes very fast always. So spelling changes every 30 years, and important concepts change very much. So a text of 80 years ago is really sometimes hard to read. So that has been published, and now I'm working on a new English translation. And then I compared my translations from the Dutch version back to King, and I found that all textual passages where Temples compares Western and African ontology and epistemology, and where he stresses that our knowledge systems are different but equal, are erased in the English version by King. Not just mistranslated, but they disappear. I will give just one example, which I now read from my translation of the Dutch version. Of course, there is no translation in the King version, but because this text is not there. This is a bit longer quote from Temples. So he said, the insight of the indigenous in the nature of things, as well as the many distinctions made by learned scholars, are both intellectual knowledge of essential being. Both forms of understanding don't differ in their being knowledge. Both are knowledge of essential, both intellectual knowledge of essential being. Both forms of understanding don't differ in their being knowledge. Both are knowledge of essential beings. Metaphysics and the thought system they build on a certain understanding of essential being is philosophy. End of quote. Now, I can leave it at just this one example because the others are similar. But over the several pages, I found like 5 of this type of sentences just appearing in the English translation. So anywhere where Bantu philosophy and Western philosophy are put on an equal footing by Temples, or even where he criticizes Western philosophy and tends to value Bantu philosophy as more insightful, as a higher, so to speak, the sentences are erased. And so also the specific understanding by Temples of vital energy as essence does not come across well in King. Now this was the second part in which I discussed the King translation. I can go deeper into it, and also, of course, later when you have your own questions to me, because I think there may be many questions. I will go to the third part. So that is the more systematic part of the lecture, which treats of the question, what does this mean for the understanding of human nature relations? So how does reality appear to the Bantu? First, we have to say that although humanity experiences itself as the center of natural forces, as ordered by a divine source, they, humanity, do not stand above nature. So it's not like here you have humans and there you have nature. The humans are part of nature. Although there is a hierarchy between all beings, as we discussed before in the introduction. So all being is natural and is the expression of energy that is an energy that has a divine source. And that is its essential character. That's the essential character of all being, all individual beings. And the second point is that all being is relational. So Temples himself uses the metaphor of the spider's web, which I also already mentioned, where any movement in a single thread makes the entire web tremble. And the third point, which is important, is that Temple stresses that the reality, according to the Bantu, is, and now I quote him again, is not a chaotic whole of forces that wriggle through each other and bump into each other. And of course, it is rather an orderly whole that they understand, the Bantu understand and investigate according to their metaphysic principles. So according to the way natural forces work on each other. Now Temples understands these principles, these natural forces, to be hierarchical, with God at the top, so to speak, of the hierarchy, following whom are the deified founders of human society, the ancestors, the normal dead, the living, the unborn, the animals, mineral life, etc. Now, maybe it's important to say a few words about this type of worldview, which also has been described by others writing about African worldview or African philosophy. Mostly the work is, of course, very well known by John Beattie, who wrote African Philosophy and Religions, connecting from the many different cultures and different religions on the African continent. And Beattie tries to distill a kind of common denominator, a commonality of things, which also corresponds very much with what Temples describes in Bantu philosophy. This book, Bantu Philosophy, starts with kind of theoretical part, a few chapters which explain metaphysics, epistemology, how to understand this from a Western perspective, and then it has an empirical part. And this empirical part has not been very much looked into. That has chapters on psychology, on ethics, on law, and on reparation of evil. And in these empirical chapters, these aspects of how society is organized play a large part. So how he describes how in these clan structured societies, the leaders of the clan are considered to be closer to this divine energy. So they are understood to have more wisdom to lead the society. And but all the same, this leadership is also mediated by democratic structures, as others like Kwasi Wiredu have described in their work. So councils where different parts of the society are represented, like women council and a men council, or where the young can speak and the older can speak, etc. These all bring their perspectives to the clan leader, and from his or her, mostly his more divine wisdom, this leader will divine inspired wisdom. They will find the solution between all these different perspectives. And but this clan leader is not an absolute leader, because he stands below the ancestors. So the ancestors are those deceased of the clan who had a major function in the society. So not any deceased is an ancestor. An ancestor is someone who mostly lived a long life, did a lot of good for the society, and so also is remembered well as an inspiring force. So this inspirational energy, so to speak, is the most important thing. And these ancestors are also not at the top because, or at the bottom if you go downwards into inspirational sources, so to speak. Top or bottom are just metaphors, because the original founder of the clan or of the society is closest to the divine realm. Now, the divine realm is also peopled by divinities. So, and in the end, there's one, creator God, which provides all this energy. But this pantheon of human beings is still not, human and divine beings is still not full, because there are also people from other clans, of course. There are also the unborn. So the idea is in the African cultures that the unborn somehow already exist and want to be born. So therefore, marriage and procreation is also seen as very important, because you have to give the unborn chance to come into this world, so to speak. And then there are different types of relations between humans and animals. Some animals may be taboo animals, or maybe protector animals, or maybe hunted animals. Plants, especially trees, also are important in the society, but not only trees, also of course herbs and plants that can be used for food. Mineral life, the rocks, the water, the wind, everything is part of this universe of individual essential beings. So Temple said it was not a chaotic whole. It doesn't wriggle through each other or bump into each other, but it is a very complex whole. And that's why the Bantu ontology is also, when you read this empirical part, is also quite complex. So most commentators focus on the very simple theory of temples. There's life force, and that is different than, as a principle, than the static essentialism of European philosophy. But they forget to discuss this whole pleroma of living beings in the empirical part of the book. Now, concerning one of the issues with the relations between humans and the rest of life, Temple's remarks in his book that some researchers claim that the Bantu also understand rocks, plants, etc., to exert life energy towards humans. But he denies this. He says they are wrong, these ethnologists, because this is contrary, he says, to their hierarchical interpretation of forces. Now, in trying to understand the book, I always had a bit of a problem with this part, because I thought that he dismissed the idea that plants and rivers, etc., could influence humans too easily, and that he understood this hierarchy of being among the Bantu a bit too static still, a bit too European. And I've been looking for answers to this problem for many years, and then recently I found this article, of which I wanted to talk, by the Congolese scholar Patrick Monga Kasimba. And in this article, he critiqued exactly this part of the Bantu philosophy hypothesis. And I already referred to the fact that Monga Kasimba himself also has knowledge of the terminology in Kiluba and Kipemba. So he refers also to the Bantu languages in his paper. And he discusses how the Kiluba concepts could explain further how Bantu thought can be philosophically systematized better. And that is not a problem, would not be a problem for Placide Tempels himself, because in the book he even writes that this is just a hypothesis and he is waiting for others to extend on it or improve it. So Bantu philosophy was not meant to be a kind of doctrine which you have to swallow as a whole. Now, Monga Kasimba denies that a hierarchical order best explains relationality in nature, as the Bantu peoples understand it. He borrows from the philosophy, to explain it, of Alfred North Whitehead, the process philosophy, as some of you may know, and says that relations in nature, including human nature relations, work rather, and now I quote, holistic, interactive, circular. So we could say that if Monga Kasimba is right, and I find his thesis convincing, that Tempels didn't take his spiderweb metaphor seriously enough, since any movement in any single thread affects the entire web. In that sense, we are all equal. And with we, I mean here non-human animals, trees, human animals, the disease, etc. We are all equal insofar as our energy still remains even after we have pulled the thread of the web, so to speak. Now, if we repair Bantu philosophy in this sense by taking the hierarchy not in a kind of up and down manner and as a static system, but as a whole in the sense of a circle or a web, which in itself has hierarchies in the sense that some of the energies are stronger and others are weaker, but not in the sense that this is a fixed order. If we repair it thus, Bantu philosophy would even give a better explanation of human nature relations, of their reality as it appears to us, as we are nowadays more and more forced to see that a single virus can influence human politics as well as the other way around. Human policy decisions will influence how well that virus will thrive or will be banned from our society. Here also, for an ecological ethics, Bantu ethics, as described by Tempels, could be helpful. One should support and enhance the life force, according to this Bantu ethics, as we find it in the empirical part of the book. One should support and enhance the life force of all members of society. Only when by repetition a member chooses evil, that is the destruction of the vital energy of others, they may be banned from society. So when we translate the concept, which was in Dutch levenskracht, to vital force, the meaning of I think this translation is also a bit problematic. So you may not have noticed, but if you were a Bantu philosophy expert, you may have noticed it translates not mostly to vital force, but to either life force or rather life energy. As the Dutch concept levenskracht translates better like that, I think. And also because the meaning of the concept of force is normally tied to the language of physics. And that suggests that Tempels saw this vital force as a physical principle. I think that the translation as life energy is better because that is mainly understood in present-day English as a social and spiritual connection. And that is also the way that Tempels mainly describes it in the book. He mainly talks about the human society and also about the wider society of humans and other natural beings included. So thus we don't extrapolate from a non-human, non-moving physical forces language, so to speak, to society and spirituality, but the other way around. According to this view in Bantu philosophy, from the spiritual and social relations that you see among living beings, you understand nature. So nature as a society of beings with psychological explanations, with laws. We can make the laws also, and the other beings also make their laws, and there's also morality in this relation. So if we can extend this idea of society to the non-human or the more than human, as sometimes called, I think this could bring many interesting new ideas for eco-phenomenology. So that was my lecture, and I thank you very much for your patience to listen. And I hope that I will get some interesting feedback. Thank you, Niels.
Thank you, Angela, for the again very nice presentation, and I think we have lots of material to discuss about. So I stop the recording now.